Hello, and welcome to all the people that is joining us for this virtual event. Special greetings to the Colombo Americano Centers Network and the Aula Network in Latin America. My name is Denise Martinez. I'm the head of cultural services at the Centro Cultural Colombo Americano in Cali. And today I have the pleasure of presenting Aisha Matthews from the Museum of Science Fiction in Washington. Today's event is presented by the Centro Cultural Colombo Americano in Cali with the support of the U.S. Embassy in Bogota and in partnership with Confandi, the Museum of Science Fiction in Washington, and the Colombo Americano Centers Network. The event is presented as part of three important cultural programs that are celebrated this month. First is, of course, the Science Fiction and Fantasy thematic programming. Second is the Museum's International Week, organized by the Valle del Cauca Museums Network. And the third is the Afro Diasporic Dialogues program, organized with the support of the U.S. Embassy in Bogota. We invite you to visit the Colombo Americano and Confandi's websites, as well as our social media, to learn more about the different activities we have prepared for you as part of the sci-fi and fantasy thematic programming. Now, without further ado, let's welcome our special guest, Aisha Matthews. Aisha, hello, how are you?
Hi, Denise. Thanks so much for having me. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. It's a pleasure, as I said, to have you here with us for this very interesting conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Aisha Matthews is the managing editor of the Museum of Science Fiction Journal of Science Fiction and the director of literary programming for the museum's annual Escape Velocity Conference. As an independent scholar, her research centers on science and speculative fictions, cultural futurisms, most specifically afrofuturism, African-American literature, feminist theory, biopolitics, disability studies, and literary postmodernism. In addition to various journal publications, her first book chapter, Conspiracies of the Flesh, Disciplinary Power and Female Embodiment in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, was published in the collection Critical Insights, Conspiracies in 2020. Perhaps most importantly, Aisha is committed to the advancement and anti-racist pedagogy and inclusive practices within the academy and its surrounding institutions. You can learn more about her work on her website, which you can find in the comments below. So in today's conversation, we are going to approach different subjects regarding Aisha's work in the museum, but also her work as researcher. So let's start talking about the museum. If you can, Aisha, tell us more about the museum's vision, about its collections, and of course, the Journal of Science Fiction, and the event it organizes, among them the annual Escape Velocity Conference, of which you are the director of literary programming.
Definitely. So the Museum of Science Fiction's goal is really to bridge the gap between the arts and the sciences, specifically for us, the gap between science and science fiction, by exploring the intersections of science, STEAM education, and the arts. So we have a traveling collection of artifacts that does pop-up displays around the United States variously throughout the year. It is live at our annual Escape Velocity conference. So if you are able to attend, you can see it in person there. I have some cool photos of that for later. So we've done a lot of programming to really try to support these initiatives, one of which being a previous partnership with NASA. We did a lecture series with them to offer insight into the inner workings of science fiction and space exploration. And then Escape Velocity, our annual conference, is really our biggest offering. We bring together scholars, creators, artists, scientists, and fans for a kind of half Comic-Con, half academic conference. So that is one of the things that I think makes us unique. We plan a lot of programming, much of it on different tracks, being literature, film, popular culture, science, and technology, just to name a few. And through those, you know, we've had a chance to discuss some really interesting topics and to draw people, both academic and fan, into the discussion, which I think is kind of rare in the conference circuit. A lot of times it's either, you know, fans as a Comic-Con and you do cosplay, or it's academics at my more stuffy kind of conference. So I had in the past a lady dressed all in blue as a Klingon, giving a presentation on linguistics and created science fiction languages. So we've been able to do some really cool things there. We've also had some great keynote speakers. We've had Cass Anbar and Dominique Tipper from The Expanse in various years. I actually met Dominique, she was very awesome. And Gigi Edgley from Farscape. We've also had author David Brin, Greg Bear, so a lot of big names in science fiction. Here you can see some photos from our exhibits. You know, you've got your Darth Vader, you've got this little girl looking at artifacts, so it's a really immersive experience. There you can see some of the panels. These are just some of the panels I've been on. We've actually had hundreds in the past, but these are some on Afrofuturism, great Gigi Edgley from Farscape. So we talked about space opera. So there are a lot of different topics we cover. You know, these are also some of my fun photos when I met Dominique Tipper and things like that. So it's always a really good time. There are a lot of interesting installations we put together and events we hold. There are drone races. There's been a green screen in the past. We've had, you know, the new Tesla there for people to look at, all kinds of very cool things like that. And this is just a few of the photos from our exhibit. These are artifacts that have been donated from individual fans and collectors, or people have made. We have a lot of artwork, some of which we auction every year. So there's just a lot of cool stuff to see in the experience that we try to provide. And so that's kind of our, you know, we had to, unfortunately, like so many organizations, pivot away from EV in 2020 because of the pandemic. So we launched our digital version of the series, Escape Velocity Extra, in 2020. And thus far, we've done, I think, about 5 of them. They haven't been strictly monthly, but topics have included, once again, created languages. We did one on women in aeronautics, where we had women from NASA come and speak. And the one pictured here is on race and resistance in science fiction. So we had a lot of great scholarly discussion, and then we had a nice discussion with Tim Russ, who was Star Trek Voyager's Tuvok, Garrett Wong, who was Voyager's Ensign Kim, and Peter Macon, who is Bortus in the Orville. So we had a lot of really great conversation about both what it is to play a person of color in science fiction television and what it is to be an actor in this space. And then lastly, and closest to my heart, we have the Journal of Science Fiction. We are a triannual peer-reviewed open access scholarly publication. So that means we come out 3 times a year. We do double-blind peer review to ensure that the scholarly rigor of our articles meets the standards of the industry. And most importantly, we are open access, meaning that we do not charge a fee. A lot of organizations put up a paywall for their journals as a means of generating revenue, but we are really in tone with our mission. We're really invested in making sure that our information that we produce is accessible to everyone and that it advances people's investment in science fiction scholarship. So yeah, that's kind of those are our biggest offerings.
Yes, and I want to say to people that is watching us that you can actually go to the museum's website and you can find there the Journal of Science Fiction. The editions are there, so you have them to read and enjoy the articles. I also wanted to ask when the Escape Velocity conference was in person, how long was it?
So Escape Velocity was held over 3 days, usually either it was a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So we would do, you know, the literature track alone had maybe 15 to 18 panels per year. and each track had somewhere around that many. So we were doing, almost 100 panels for the week. So we were splitting those up over 3 days. A lot of them do overlap, but it gives people, we try to give people an opportunity to go to as much programming as they'd like. And as I mentioned, there's really no division between fans and scholars. So anyone can come to any panel. If you can only come one of the days, we did sell 1-day tickets as well as weekend passes, and we gave a lot away to underserved communities as well.
And thinking about this year, is there anything that you can say about the event of this year, or not just yet?
Not just yet. So we're looking at EV 2022 is when we plan to be back in person. So 2021, we will likely continue our digital series. But I'm hoping that, besides the fact that it will give us a lot of lead up time, a lot of people who've participated in the past and many big names will be kind of itching to get back in the conference circuit. So I think we're, keeping our fingers crossed that we can get some really good talent for 2022.
Okay, so something to look forward.
Definitely.
2022. I was going to say for the people that is watching us that they can actually see some of the events that you organized from the last year's Escape Velocity Conference. They are on the museum's website.
Yes, we have some. We also, on our press page, have links to a few of the places we were pictured, and some of those publications and outlets actually took photos of their own to post to the event as well. So between those, we got a pretty good selection.
Well, this year's central topic to the International Museums Week is Reimagining Museum. You have already mentioned some way in which the museum has had to reshape or readjust the events that the museum used to do before the pandemic. But can you tell us a little bit more how has the global pandemic reshaped the programming of the museum, and as well describe how the museum has overcome the challenges for maintaining its sustainability?
Yeah, absolutely. I think our biggest challenge of having to go digital is, we are a relatively fledgling organization. We're a nonprofit. So a lot of our revenue came from the in-person event at Escape Velocity, as well as our donors. And so in order to really keep programming going, we've had to kind of reevaluate a lot of our verticals, things like the challenges of marketing, of being sure the right people know about our events and that we're getting the word out, affording talent. There are a lot of actors and authors who usually draw their income from appearing at conferences. So, they've had to kind of adapt their way of participating, and that has benefited us in many ways, but it's also, you want to be careful asking people who do such great work to contribute for free. So trying to create opportunities where they also get something from it, I think has definitely been a challenge. And really drawing viewer engagement. It's very easy in digital events for people to sign up for a Zoom meeting and then completely forget about it. So it's been, really key. A lot of our events are 2 parts. So finding a way to maintain the momentum into that second part and making sure people tune back in was definitely a challenge. But I think a lot of the ways we've overcome that, we have a great team, a great executive team that's been finding ways, Escape Velocity Extra came out of that team, and ways that we could leverage our existing contacts, pursuing new opportunities and partnerships. We were previously at the Gaylord National Resort in DC for our conference for the past 2 years, and our contract ended. So it will be looking to negotiate with new vendors in 2022. And really, I think most importantly, trying to support one another and just be a source of positivity for everyone else on the team. A lot of people have had personal hardship. And so to kind of reward people for their ongoing interest in the organization and giving them something to look forward to.
Thinking about the future of museums in general, and thinking about sort of this post-COVID context, which we're hoping to get there, in which ways do you think will change sort of the museum's relationship with their communities and the experiences museums offer to them?
Yeah, I think a lot of museums should really consider, first and foremost, how reliant they are on in-person presence to draw interest in what they're doing. I think historically going to a museum, whether it's, you're a museum person and you love that, or you go on a school field trip and that's the only time you ever go, which is a lot of Americans, fortunately or unfortunately, the being there and keeping the artifacts there is something I think we rely on very heavily, of getting people into the building. So in a world in which even post-COVID, we may not be gathering in, groups of hundreds or thousands anytime soon, kind of how can we bring the value of these museums into the hands of the viewers and interested parties, whether that looks like investing in video technology, posting images of certain exhibitions online, creating staggered schedules, those kind of things to really do population control in the physical spaces to make sure we're still kind of maximizing what you get from these museums, but also how we can take it out of the physical space to increase the amount of people who can access it. I'd also say the cost and required skills to develop digital programming. I think a lot of organizations, you assume yeah, we'll just get on Zoom and we'll figure it out. But as I'm sure you've discovered, there are a lot of technical things that have to be done, a lot of editing, things like that. And the cost of those things is not necessarily something most in-person museums have built into their budgets. So I think it will be interesting to see which organizations are able to develop digital programming. And I hope to see some grants being offered to encourage people to go online and to make their collections available to people who can't come there in person. I also think hybrid events will be a bigger thing in terms of having a both visual and in-person component. I'm interested to see how that will work out because it has many of the same challenges of virtual events, making sure people have the same experience. But I think people are anxious to get back into public spaces. So it's really a matter of providing a no hassle kind of way to engage with these materials. And lastly, I would say doubling down on existing digital offerings. The Museum of Science Fiction included. I think in the past, we've taken a lot of pictures for press that were more to kind of capture the moment, but not necessarily with a strong focus on displaying the look and feel of the event online. And so I think in the future, things like perhaps video recording certain panels, keynote speeches, and making those available, whether it's free or for a nominal fee after the event, is a way to kind of keep those conversations going.
Now moving to your work as a researcher. Well, you have extensive research experience focused on speculative fiction in literature. So could you please just take a brief moment to explain what speculative fiction is and in which ways it is different to genres that we are maybe more familiar with, such as science fiction or fantasy?
Yeah, so science fiction has long, since Darko Suvin, who's kind of considered one of the critical fathers of the genre, science fiction has been known largely as the literature of cognitive estrangement. And that means it estranges us from our usual reality with kind of elements that aren't here right now. But the cognitive part is that it is based largely on things that would make sense within our physical world. Maybe they don't exist yet, but they're developments of our existing technology. So science fiction is often very anchored in realism, in trying to, even in portraying things that haven't happened yet or couldn't happen with our technology. It's really about kind of, to some extent, staying in the world of natural laws and looking at how technology as we understand it changes things. Speculative fiction is really a broader umbrella that includes all kinds of speculation. So if we look at the word speculation, anytime you imagine something that's not real and say, I wonder how this would turn out, that's speculation. So that really enables us to include, futurisms, alternate histories, fantasy, horror, and science fiction. So really anything, there are many people who say, for instance, that political science fiction maybe isn't real science fiction, right? Because it doesn't talk about technology. But when you talk about a different way of governing that we haven't tried before, or different political investments, you're doing a form of speculative fiction. So I really like to think of it as the umbrella term inside which science fiction is located. I will also say that many cultural futurisms are speculative. And when I say cultural futurisms, I mean Afrofuturism, Chicana futurism, a lot of these culturally specific visions of what the past might have looked like and what the future could look like. And a lot of those are speculative because maybe they focus on magic or magical realism or the supernatural or spiritualism, all things which the Western canon often has times respecting as science fiction. So by studying speculative fiction, I open the door for a lot of those other ways of talking about the future that really broaden our understanding of what speculative fiction can be.
Mm-hmm. Right, and with that, you sort of have you're going to my next question, and it's, what is your personal interest in the speculative fiction sort of genre, and why do you think it is important to bring attention upon them, and in general, why do you think they are important to society?
Yeah, so I get to say my line, which is now kind of becoming like my tagline, because I really believe that realism, the great books we think of, even Toni Morrison, Walt Whitman, a lot of realism was the literature of the 19th and 20th centuries. Science and speculative fiction, to me, is the literature of the 21st century. When we think about why are there so many science fiction shows on TV, why does it seem like it's everywhere? Well, we're living in a world where there's this unprecedented use of technologies, of things we haven't seen before and don't know how they'll work out. And so speculative fiction is a place where we can look at those things. So for example, technology creates all sorts of circumstances that will change our world. We think of questions of AI, of creating artificial beings. Who gets control of those beings? Do we grant them full rights in our society? All things that we've maybe thought about a little, but science always outpaces ethics and things like that. The fact that we can do it is often, whether we should do it is often an afterthought to whether we can do it. So I think a lot of science fiction gives us an opportunity to look at what that could mean before we're embroiled in it, to look at how we want to approach these different ideas that arise, that we haven't really decided how we're going to deal with them yet. I also think speculative fiction gives us enough distance from our reality that we can consider a lot of things that are too painful or personal to explore, especially in the United States with the growing unrest over, race-based policing and police violence and things like that. Especially for a lot of African Americans and Black people in America, it gets very tiring and kind of painful to look at these stories, the real things that are happening, and think through them critically. So speculative fiction gives us just enough distance to look at those problems and look at how humanity is and acts without it having the same emotional resonance. So I think that is big for cross-cultural understanding in particular. Especially across the Black-white divide in America. I think speculative fiction gives us a lot of ways to see each other that maybe the mainstream media may not be able to. I would also say it's a great way to explore different cultures' visions of the future. And we've had some of that. Afrofuturism is probably the most popular, cultural futurism right now, but looking at how different pasts might have preserved or altered our cultural heritage, I think is important to give people insight into really the effect of colonialism. That is one thing science fiction does very well, is look at the impact of colonialism on certain cultures and how, without its influence, or had things turned out differently, how many cultures would look much different than they do today. And I would say lastly, it's important because it draws together that science, arts, technology, those very disparate fields that a lot of people want to not be connected, into this very interdisciplinary world. So science fiction just gives us the opportunity to study a lot of different things that maybe in a more traditional genre you wouldn't be able to do all at once.
Yes, absolutely. And I also think that speculative fiction not only helps to see difficult subjects or difficult matters from the distance, but also helps people sort of to be sympathetic with situations or with characters that might be so different to them, you know, and that maybe in real life you might not feel as sympathetic with such a person, such a way of thinking.
Absolutely. I think, you know, there's a lot, most of us when we read fiction, you know, we're meant to identify with the lead characters. That's kind of how it's often written. So I think that's a very good point, that it allows you to put yourself in other people's shoes. I think people of color are often very used to imagining themselves as protagonists in works where they're not necessarily included. But I think there's been less history of people in mainstream racial and cultural groups experiencing or imagining themselves as people of color. And I do think science fiction, by the nature of it being fiction and how a lot of it is written, gives people that opportunity to see the similarities in all of us as well as the differences.
Yes, exactly. So yes, you said it. We've discussed how science fiction has the power to spark interest. Also, this is part of the museum's sort of mission to spark interest in science, in arts, technology, and how it also reflects difficult subject matters that mirror the fears, concerns, problems of society where it's produced. In that regards, I wanted to add to what you were saying, that that's why science fiction was also, for example, very popular during the 50s, when there was all these worries and concerns regarding nuclear experiments, about Cold War, etc., etc. And so the subjects on which you have focused your research reflect on race and on gender resistance stories, thinking, for example, in the works of Margaret Atwood and The Handmaid's Tale, and also in Octavia Butler's work. So focusing specifically on the Black experience, Black resistance, Afrofuturism, which you have mentioned, which narratives, being from the literature, film, television, you believe are the most relevant today, and why?
So I'd like to start by saying that Afrofuturism is largely a project of reclamation. You know, as many colonialized cultures have experienced, a lot of our histories have been eradicated. And so to some extent, you know, history is written by the victors. So Afrofuturism, at its core, is doing a lot of work to reimagine some of that history we've lost, and potentially to reimagine it in ways that would turn out very differently from how things actually turned out. But most importantly for me is envisioning a technologically advanced future that is consistent with Afro-diasporic cultures and lifeways. In the West, we tend to portray Africa and the diaspora as uncivilized, as uncultured. And so we don't really traditionally think of technology in Africa as being, you know, very interrelated. We think of technology, digital technology, most of us, as a very Western thing. And so Afrofuturism in particular has spent a lot of time envisioning how technology, advanced technology, would look if it were not based on a colonial past, which is why Black Panther, I think, was so powerful for so many people, because it showed this beautiful, technologically advanced, clearly African civilization with no signs of colonization. And it kind of really reminds people that despite the indoctrination you've received in the West, there is a lot of complex, rich, interesting culture in Africa and the diaspora that aren't in the past, that they are very much in the present and in the future. So in that sense, I think it is also more in tune with the environment than many Western narratives. A lot of Afro-diasporic cultures kind of value the land and our relationship with it in a different way. It's more in tune with spirituality and what we call techno-spiritualism. So when you think of stories where a person's consciousness or their soul is transferred from their original body to another body, looking at how the spirit gets tangled with technology is something Afrofuturist works are very good at doing. And offering positive and complex Black representation. So with that in mind, I think some of the types of stories that are most compelling right now, stories of planetary exile. The idea of being forced to leave your home planet or your home nation is very resonant to the African diaspora because of the Middle Passage. So there's a lot of stories that focus on what it's like to lose your home, what it's like to be a displaced people, whether that is on our planet or in space, and kind of what that does to the culture of the people. Probably most obviously stories about policing. It makes me think of District 9. I believe that movie was about 10 years old or so. But you know, the idea of people who look different coming into a very colonized space and how they're racially treated, how that's my interest in biopolitics and to some extent to necropolitics. Biopolitics is the control of bodies and spaces to gain power. Necropolitics is the control of death, who gets to live and who gets to die and how that looks. And so I think that's very intertwined with policing. And as we look at things like George Floyd's death, which I know has been publicized around the world, and a lot of other high profile cases, really looking into how Black lives are oftentimes still very devalued is something that Afrofuturism really tries to wrestle with. It also looks at what I'd call modern day slavery, you know, whether it's the prison industrial complex or the school to prison pipeline, or you know, unconscionable labor practices that are practiced in a lot of prisons, or, you know, disabled people have often been exploited for their labor. So a lot of times enslavement for Afro-diasporic peoples has a very specific past connotation of the mid-Atlantic slave trade. But I think the genre is starting to help us look towards forms of modern day enslavement in these Western systems and encouraging people to really rethink how fundamental these systems are to human life, if there's another way that we can do things. And lastly, I'd say, and probably most presently, the stories of respectability politics. I think existing as a brown person in predominantly white spaces, there are a lot of ways in which brown people are encouraged to make themselves smaller, to minimize the way they present culturally. You know, some cultures speak more with their hands and they're very animated. Some cultures are known for having louder, more boisterous voices. And a lot of Western spaces kind of try to sanitize that in many ways, whether intentional or unintentional. And so a lot of these stories are giving us a place to discuss what it is to be told that the way you are is not respectable, that it's not professional or acceptable, and kind of what that means for individuals and for cultures. So I think Afrofuturism is telling a lot of these stories right now in ways that are really meaningful.
I'm thinking now about specific examples of stories that are out there. What can you recommend us to read, to watch, or what also are your favorite science fiction or speculative fiction books, films, TV shows, maybe that are just recent, or maybe that have some years now?
Yeah, so, you know, that's a can of worms, because as I'm sure you can see, this whole bookshelf here is science fiction, so I have quite a lot to choose from. pretty much anything by Octavia Butler. I think she is one of the most influential writers that we've had in Afrofuturism. You know, it's unfortunate she passed in 2006, so, you know, far before I was a professional scholar. But a lot of her work, she's really interested in eugenics, actually, and for Black people, it is rare to see Black stories where eugenics are portrayed as anything other than negative. I think she was really interested in positive eugenics and the way that we shape cultures. So her Pattern Master series is about a society of telepaths that has been genetically engineered from all these generations of Black people who have psychic talents. And so it's really looking at what it means to create a race of people, and kind of undermines the idea that Europeans are the only ones who could have and did do that, that in many ways, many cultures have done that for good or for ill. Her Lilith's Brood series is a post-apocalyptic series of the future where a Black woman awakens to find that the rest of humanity has essentially been abducted by aliens because we destroyed our planet environmentally, and they said, we'll fix your planet for you, but now you have to mate with us. And so there are a lot of interesting questions about hybridity, about what it means to be both self and other, and about where the line is drawn for what it means to be human. Because we're moving into this post-human era where, you know, a lot of us maybe have physical devices that, whether it's your cell phone, which all of us have, to a hearing aid or a prosthetic limb, we're all kind of melding with these other non-human ways of being. And so Butler in particular is really interested in looking at what it means to be human and how attached we are to just being human versus becoming something more than human. I would say Andrea Hairston is also really interesting. She is more in the magical realism space, but she focuses a lot on, at least in the book I'm thinking of, We'll Do Magic for Small Change, she focuses on kind of past lives and beings coming to this world that weren't from here and interacting with life and with various cultures, particularly Afro-diasporic cultures. So there's a lot of discussion about assimilation, about magic in general, and kind of how we tend to associate magic with the non-intellectual. Oftentimes it's devalued as superstition. So a lot of these authors do a good job of elevating it in a way that it doesn't have to be magic or science. It can be both. And that's really one of the things I love about science fiction, Afrofuturism in particular. A few other titles, I would say Nalo Hopkinson, Brown Girl in the Ring and Midnight Robber. She spends a lot of time putting like Afro-diasporic, particularly Caribbean influences into her work. So you see a lot of really interesting, advanced, futuristic versions of Caribbean cultural icons and religious icons, recovering certain linguistic patterns of Afro-Caribbean groups. Particularly the accent. She brings a lot of dialect into her work. And so while it may be hard for some particularly Western readers or non-English speakers, it also gives you a really different vision of a different type of life that's always been here in the West, that is clearly influenced by colonial culture, but which has maintained a lot of its own history. And Nnedi Okorafor as well. She is an African artist or author who's become very big in the States. She is probably one of my favorites right now. She writes a lot of, her Binti series is about, it's kind of like Butler's series with, going into the world and meeting this alien species. And she essentially discovers that her cultural heritage is what allows her to become the mediator between her race and this alien race that is so very different from us. And so Okorafor looks a lot particularly African heritage, what it is to be an African in America or an African really anywhere, but also looking at particularly African visions of culture and technology. So I think in that, she's probably the closest to Black Panther in terms of imagining very advanced Black societies where culture is intrinsic to the technology.
These are amazing examples that you have brought to us. And I must ask, because most of them are women. And so I wonder if this is like a personal interest, or if actually most of the speculative fiction, the Afrofuturism literature has been written by women.
So I will say some of the bigger names, Samuel L. Delaney, who just about everyone's heard of, Stephen Barnes and Walter Mosley are some of the most prominent either current or pseudo-current male Afrofuturist writers. I think there's just been an increased interest in the Black woman's position. And so Black women have been empowered to write a lot of books from that subject position. So I'm sure there are an equal amount of Black male Afrofuturist authors, but a lot of my favorite works are inflected by that question of gender. So that's probably where we get to where we are. I will say two shows that I forgot to mention. One is Lovecraft Country. I believe Jordan Peele produced that. It's based on Lovecraft's books. It is a horror, so it is not for the faint of heart, but it is probably one of the most visionary reimaginings of the 1950s that I've seen on television. And ironically, there are monsters in that show everywhere, but racism is actually the real villain. Racism is the scariest thing in that show, the way they portray it. So I think it gives people, it is profound, and I definitely wouldn't recommend it for the faint of heart. But it does really give a profound sense of what it was like to be Black in these racist spaces in the 50s, and to kind of help you see many ways in which we still have a long way to go, particularly in the United States. Also a South African work called Noughts and Crosses by Mallory Blackman. It was a 4-book series, and it has now been produced into a TV show on NBC's Peacock. And it is an alternate history of African colonization in which Africa colonized Europe. And so they're living in the present day with the African population as the majority colonizing population, and their Caucasian population is the minority. And so, of course, the main characters are a young Black girl from a prominent family and a young white boy whose mother works for her family, and they fall in love. And so it's a really interesting kind of race-inflected Romeo and Juliet story, but seeing it portrayed on the screen, it's very powerful, not in the sense that anyone being colonized is good, but I think it is often difficult for us in the West to imagine what it would have looked like if Africa had colonized anywhere else. So that probably gives the closest vision I can think of to what it probably would have been like.
Wow, this like I want to go and look for them after we finish talking.
I'm happy to provide a list.
And also because now that you mentioned Jordan Peele, like I feel like he's not surprised that he will be involved in a show as such, like from his previous work directing Us, which is also a horror movie, and Get Out, which was also very well known. And I guess that Get Out, it's also in sort of this speculative fiction universe, I would say.
Right. Yeah, and I think, he is bringing an interesting dimension to horror. Horror has always been kind of an offshoot of science fiction that, you're either into it or you're not. I am personally not a huge fan of horror, but all of my favorite horrors are Afrofuturist, because I think horror is really about making you feel that fear, and it's really dependent on what that fear is about. So I think particularly for African Americans and people of the African diaspora watching these things, it is meant to immerse you in that fear in a way that's meant to be invigorating, in a way that makes you think about the world differently.
Well, you were mentioning Black Panther and the worldwide success Black Panther had when it was premiered. I was wondering, maybe you think that the interest in Afrofuturism has grown after Black Panther had this sort of big success. Do you think is there an increase in the number of authors, artists that are now being visible and recognized? And maybe also if you can talk about the experience of your work in the museum, sort of giving light to these sort of narratives.
Yeah, so I would say that interest is definitely growing. The year we did Black Panther, we did our first Afrofuturism panel at Escape Velocity, and we did our Afrofuturist special issue the same month it came out. So we had a really nice confluence of ways to discuss it. But I wouldn't even say it's so much that there are more writers as there are more publishers prioritizing and highlighting their work. I think one thing we forget when we go to a bookstore is it's not just every book on the shelf represents a great author who just had the greatest story ever. It went through editors and a publisher who decided if the story was palatable enough, if it was marketable, if it would make a profit. And so in the past, I've encountered a lot of Black authors, including Octavia Butler, who while she was alive, did not get as much of the mainstream attention as many now understand and believe she should have, because it was still seen as not profitable. And so Black Panther, they didn't ever really do a full-scale Black superhero movie for the same reason. They thought, it won't be profitable. And Black Panther was so profitable that everyone had to really reevaluate, is this really about profit, or are we just kind of being a little bit racist? So we didn't want to admit it. Because once they saw how much money it was making, we saw an exponential increase in the amount that is just visible and promoted. And so I would say there were a lot of Black authors self-publishing. Nnedi Okorafor is my favorite example because she self-published her work Binti on Amazon, and she is probably one of the biggest names in Afrofuturism right now. She's got picked up by a major publisher. But it shouldn't always have to be that way. While self-publishing is great, it's really important that these publishers prioritize works by women of color, by people of color, and actually promote them. And so I would see that, there's the desire to see certain stories, our desire, what books we buy, what shows we watch, what shows up on the Nielsen rating. All of those things determine what we end up seeing on the shelf, what we end up seeing on listicles, on BuzzFeed, where it talks about, the most popular books. So the more interest we express in these stories, I think the more of them will continue to see highly visible. You asked about the museum. So in terms of my work, I've been fortunate in that, as a volunteer organization, being willing to step up and do work for free oftentimes gives you opportunities that you wouldn't have otherwise had. So even though I was a very junior scholar, when we started, I had a great opportunity to select most of the programming for the literature track. And so I've been able to pour my passions into planning for that. And I think it's one of the reasons the literature track is by far our most diverse programming, because A, those are my interests, and B, the network I've built of people who've been willing to come and speak have come back year after year offering to speak for us, to discuss new topics. And so, I think, well, I try to be balanced, and I could speak about Octavia Butler till the cows come home, and we can't do a panel on her every year. There's also a very real sense that being with the museum has allowed me to highlight what I think are really important works, and the museum being the organization that it is, I think it has drawn more attention from people of color. In a lot of museums in the States, there is still a struggle with diversity. It's still very lacking. There aren't very many women on boards of science fiction organizations. There aren't very many women in executive positions. And so a lot of scholars will come to the organization and go, I'm really interested in what you do, but I don't see any women. I don't see any people of color. So you know, being in this has allowed me to bring something to the organization, my expertise, my network, my investment in diversity, and has also kind of reciprocally helped to legitimize my work and to give me a platform, you know, as I'm here today discussing this, to really emphasize the importance of this diverse work and to really give it its day in the light.
Absolutely, and I think it's very important, sort of like talk diversity in this broader sense that also talks about intersectionality between race, between gender, which it's something that needs to be keep being promoted, you know,
Absolutely.
that kind of diversity. So yes, please go on.
I was just going to say, I think it's oftentimes, you know, a lot of organizations, we are inclined to discuss topics about diversity without actually doing anything to increase a diverse audience. And so that has been one of the struggles, and the things that I'm really proud of is that you know, I've been insistent that we become more accessible to those with disabilities, because we've had panels on disabilities, but if the disabled, if blind people, if deaf people can't participate, then are we really representing them? If we talk about Afrofuturism, but most of the panelists are not of Afro-diasporic descent, are we really giving credence to the subject? So we've drawn a lot of attention from POC, from the Black community, from the Latinx community by doing these things. And I think it's really important to walk the walk, to make sure the people who it's relevant to get in the room to discuss it.
Yeah, and I was gonna say that it goes like sort of in three ways, what you're saying, like the topics, but also how you get and how your programming is accessible to a diverse audience. And also, and I think this it's part of like the mission as well of the museum is your staff, you know, how to have a diverse staff that works at the organization.
Absolutely. And I'm glad to say that since I became managing editor of the Journal of Science Fiction, our staff there has also become more diverse. You know, there are a lot of credentialed individuals who are interested, but who maybe don't feel welcome to apply at a lot of these places because they don't see anyone who looks like them already working there. So I'm glad that I'm in a position to be visible in a way that makes people know that we're interested in their contributions, and they shouldn't hesitate to reach out to us and to be, you know, to be interested in participating.
Now I'd like to start sort of closing our conversation today. Which has been the most significant message that you have found in science fiction or speculative fiction narrative that has had an impact on you as a Black woman?
Yeah, so I think being educated in the United States, we're really often taught that Black culture and history only extends to slavery, that we are no longer Africans, we are African Americans, and our history began in slavery. And so, as I mentioned before, you get, even if no one says it specifically, you get the impression that there's nothing high tech or civilized in Africa to be proud of, no heritage that we can call our own. And I think the most significant message that's been given to me is just a vision of that Afro-diasporic technology, that future in which we are not erased. A lot of science fiction, particularly marketed as hard science fiction, deals with race by ignoring it. Either they don't talk about the color of anyone in their book, or it's just a notable absence of people of color, like as if that's how we resolved it. And so I think it is important for me, for Black people, for Black women in particular, to see ourselves in the future, not as some, you know, holdover from a bygone era, but as people who are innovating, who are bright and scientific minded and technologically advanced. And that, you know, a lot of us have, whether it's in the past or present, distanced ourselves from American representations of Blackness. They're often not very flattering, particularly if you consider yourself an intellectual. And so I think science and speculative fiction have really shown me how much that is a symptom of Eurocentricity, and to some extent of white supremacy being baked in, of just not fully coming into my respect for the culture of what we're producing. When you look at American culture, so much of American culture has been produced by African Americans and by people from the diaspora: music, fashion, art, film. But for some reason, until quite recently, we still very much treated Black culture as something that wasn't ever revolutionary. And so I think now one of the best things to take from it is it's kind of the purpose of representation. The more you see of it, the more it sinks into your subconscious as something that's normal and natural and something you should participate in. And so I think that's really probably the most profound thing it's done for me.
And do you have any advice or words of encouragement for young enthusiasts of science fiction or speculative fiction?
Yeah, so I would honestly say my best advice is to keep reading, to keep discussing it. There's this age where you hit where nothing's like, so many things are uncool. And because we're conditioned, at least in the States, that being cool is like the pinnacle of high school achievement, that you pretend not to like a lot of the things that you do, or you don't associate with certain things. I've really liked seeing the resurgence of a big fandom in anime in the United States, particularly amongst Black people, because it was something that was considered uncool. And now it is very openly embraced as, you know, part of nerdy Black culture. So I would say, you know, as a science fiction fan, don't lose your passion for it. Don't let people tell you it isn't cool or it's not relevant. You know, reach out to people who write books you like. One of my undergraduate thesis, I wrote on Scott Westerfeld's Uglies trilogy. He's a young adult science fiction writer, and he actually agreed to do a Skype call with me, and I got to do an interview with him about it. And I wasn't anyone particularly special. It was just that I reached out and asked. So I think a lot of people don't know how many authors love to hear from their fans and how much that inspires them. So, you know, continue finding ways to participate, look for events where you can meet other fans, you know, start a book club, just really enjoy the genre. And if you find an opportunity to get involved, I would encourage you to take it.
And with that great message of encouragement, we close today's event. Thank you so much, Aisha, for your words, for sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us, as well as for recommending these many authors, books, and TV shows about speculative fiction and Afrofuturism.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to all of you that joined us for this conversation with Aisha. We would love to read your comments, so please leave them below. As well, don't forget to share this video with your friends and with your family. Stay connected with the different activities organized as part of the science fiction and fantasy thematic programming, especially for those of you who are interested in Afrofuturism. Be sure to connect again for the virtual opening of Cali Fiction 3 Afrofuturism exhibition. We will enjoy a conversation with a group of young artists and curators about this exhibition. You can find the dates and all the information about this event and all our cultural agenda at the Colombo Americano website, as well as our social media. Thanks again to all our partners, the U.S. Embassy in Bogota, Confandi, the Museum of Science Fiction in Washington, the Colombo Americano Centers Network, the Habla Network in Latin America, and the Valle del Cauca Museums Network. So thank you all, and bye-bye.